Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. The sky is falling, right? Believe it or not, the Timberwolves had the exact same record on January 13th last season as they do this year. I want to break that down. What was so different about how the Wolves finished the year, though, versus where the Wolves are right now? What are the categories that they're performing most differently and in most cases worse than they were last season? Plus a preview of Wolves-Suns on Friday night. It's all upcoming on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA. Happy Friday, everybody. Happy weekend and happy Timberwolves game day. The Wolves are back home to take on the Phoenix Suns on Friday night. We'll preview that towards the end of the show. Plenty to get to first, though. Also, a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch this show on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves. Don't forget the T, and also at Beecken. That's with two B's, two E's, Cken. All right. So I want to get to Wolves-Suns later, but first I want to kind of dive into what's so different about this year's Wolves team right now to last year's Wolves team and where they finished. But interestingly enough, the Minnesota Timberwolves have the exact same record sitting here right now today on January 13th, 2023, as they did last season in 2022. I know that sounds crazy. I know that we're in the middle of this thing and it feels like the sky is falling. But at the end of the night on January 13th last year, the Timberwolves lost at Memphis on January 13th. They finished that day with a record of 20-22. Coming into January 13th, a home game against the Phoenix Suns this season, the Wolves are 20-22. Now, the circumstances aren't identical, right? I mean, last year there were certainly injuries. This was actually on the heels of that COVID kind of outbreak within the team. Remember, they lost 5 of 6 games at the end of December. They were 15-15 mid-December, lost 5 of 6. Everybody, like 7 of the 8 top rotation guys, all the starters had COVID at one point. The Wolves had Greg Monroe, signed off the street, played against Boston, a couple days after Christmas last year. There was, I'm trying to remember who was the random player that played like one game for the Wolves. Chris Silva played a game for the Wolves. Like just random stuff was happening. And so they were 16-20 kind of coming out of the holidays. Then they go on a little mini win streak. They lose a couple and they're 20-22 after 42 games. Same record as this year. The vibes feel way different. Of course, the Rudy Gobert, I'm not about to pretend like giving up 5 first rounders and beloved rotation players, impactful players for Rudy Gobert, and then seeing the team have the same record. That's obviously not a win. I'm not saying this is a good thing. I'm just for perspective's sake. And I know I've used this example a lot. The Boston Celtics last year the Wolves beat them. There was the one game the Wolves won out in like December, the 5 of 6 that they lost. The only game they won was Boston, the future Eastern Conference champs. Like they shorthanded beat the Celtics with, I guess they had a new coach last year. They have a new coach again this year. Boston obviously turned things around in a big way. The Wolves as a team, once they got healthy, remember, even before the COVID stuff hit, this was a team. They were 11-15 on December 10th, right? So this was a team that was still struggling. There were issues. They weren't shooting the ball well. Taurean Prince was shooting like 20% from 3. There were a lot of problems early last season. But where the team finished last year compared to where they are today with the same record is very different. So I want to go through a few key categories on both sides of the ball and try and dissect like what's really going on here. Why is it so important? The first thing I want to talk about, it's interesting. I always kind of matter-of-factly talk about this when I preview games that like, hey, the Wolves want to play at a fast pace. That's just, what Finch wants to do. And then comparing that to what other teams are doing. The Wolves are still playing at a fast pace. They're 6th in the league in pace this season. They've been top 5 for most of the year, although it has slowed down here of late. Last season, they finished the year number 1 in the entire league in pace, but they're only 6th this year. A related stat in my mind, I think this is directly related. Last year, the Timberwolves finished the year first in three-point attempts per game, or because they played so fast, if you factor in the number of possessions and make it a rate-based stat, they were third in three-point rate. First in attempts per game, third in three-point rate because they played at such a breakneck speed last season. This year, they're sixth in pace. They are 17th in three-point rate. Now, they're also only shooting. They're 19th in three-point percentage. They weren't a whole lot better last year. They were 12th, and for much of the year, they were the bottom half of the league. They kind of got hot towards the end of the year. But again, I think the actual attempts is more important than the percentage that you're shooting here, right? I think pace and three-point rate are closely tied. The more possessions you get, the more opportunities you have to shoot threes, right? That's obvious. The faster you play, the more open threes in transition that you're going to generate. And last season, Anthony Edwards, I felt like was shooting transition threes like crazy. D'Angelo Russell shot a bunch. Karl-Anthony Towns trail threes in transition. He's so good. Straight on. Top of the arc. Trail threes. And you're missing that this year. Also, Towns was shooting the ball so badly above the break before he got hurt. And so that, hurts the percentage. But in terms of the rate, this team should not be 17th in three-point rate. And I've talked about quite a bit on the show about how these guys that are going to progress to the mean in terms of their shooting percentage, D'Angelo Russell's the primary one, and he's been a lot better lately from deep, at least. Towns, when he gets healthy, Bryn Forbes isn't as much a regular rotation player now, but his shooting has been much worse than expected. I get Kyle Anderson's been better than expected, but the volume, it just isn't as impactful there. So I don't know that this team's actually a great three-point shooting. The evidence is that they're not a great three-point shooting team, but they can be an average three-point shooting team. They're 19th right now with Towns shooting the ball horribly, and he's been out now for half of the games played so far. Like this team should finish in that same kind of neighborhood as last year, 12th to 15th in three-point percentage. They have no business being 17th in three-point rate. It's tied to pace. If you don't play fast, you're not going to get those three-point opportunities. The causes for that, I do think part of it is trying to force feed Rudy Gobert, especially early in the season. And there's still, we'll talk this later, the first Phoenix game, I think it was, Gobert had one shot attempt. He had that one game where he had 0 shot attempts, but hit those big free throws down the stretch around the same time of the year. The Wolves spend a lot of time trying to force feed Rudy Gobert early in the season. They do that occasionally now too. And I think that slows them down, where they're kind of like, almost like you're trying to aim. Like, what's a good example? I don't know. If you're trying to hit a target with a dart and you're trying to aim, that's kind of what it feels like sometimes when they're throwing an entry pass into Rudy Gobert, regardless of who it is, really. They all do it, right? Kyle Anderson does it too, and he's probably the one that's the best at it. Defensive rebound rate and also defense, period, which we'll talk about here in a minute. It's hard to run after make, or harder to run after makes. You can do it. Teams have done it against the Wolves all season long, but it's hard to do it against good opponents, right? It's hard to run after makes, even against bad opponents. It's just easier to run after you get a defensive rebound. Well, first of all, the Wolves aren't getting very many defensive rebounds, right? That's the first issue. What are they? I think they're like 27th. They're 28th now in defensive rebound rate. So third worst team in defensive rebound rate, you're going to get less fast break opportunities. Also, they're still middle of the pack in defense. They're 16th in defensive rating. I think they were like 12th before the debacle against Detroit on Wednesday. But you're pretty middle of the pack in defense. You're a bad defensive rebound rate team. You're giving up a lot of transition points. You're going to have less opportunities to run yourself as a team. That, to me, is the primary culprit. I also think something that's maybe not as obvious on its face, I don't think D'Angelo Russell and Anthony Edwards push pace in the same way that Jordan McLaughlin, Patrick Beverley last season, even Kyle Anderson when he runs offense. I think even though his nickname is Slow-Mo, I think those guys all push pace more than D'Lo and Ant. And we're seeing a lot more Anthony Edwards running offense in the absence of Jordan McLaughlin. And also and I know D'Lo ran a lot of the offense last year when Beverley essentially played off the ball, but Beverley would push pace. When Pat Bev got a defensive rebound or he got an outlet, he pushed pace. And he was more than happy to get into the paint. D'Lo doesn't like to get into the paint at any point in time, and transition included. He's going to shoot that pull-up three. And Bev did sometimes too. And there's nothing wrong with the pull-up three in a lot of scenarios. But all I'm saying is that Ant and D'Lo are much more comfortable slowing things down, getting themselves into an isolation set, giving themselves a pull-up three when it's 1-on-3 or 2-on-4, or letting the rest of the team catch up and then still operating in an isolation or operating pick and roll instead of running an actual set or pushing in transition, getting a corner look from Jaden McDaniels or getting a dunk from Jaden McDaniels or Rudy Gobert. There's just too high of a comfort level to slow things down for a mediocre shot. Yes, D'Lo and Ant can make long and contested three-pointers. No, they're almost never the best shot. If it's in rhythm and it's in transition, you can take deep threes. We've seen that the drive and kick where D'Lo actually trails in transition or passes it and gets the pass back for a deep three in rhythm on the catch. That's a much better shot than a somewhat contested pull-up that's deep. And D'Lo and Ant do that stuff all the time. So this is admittedly somewhat anecdotal. But if you watch, I mean, we can't watch Patrick Beverley and Jordan McLaughlin in a Wolves uniform now, but when McLaughlin gets back, and currently even Kyle Anderson, hopefully he plays Friday, he missed Wednesday's game with the illness, those guys push pace a little bit more than D'Lo and Ant. And I think that ultimately that plays into pace, obviously, and then also in turn the three-point rate. They're generating less three-point opportunities because of the slower pace that they're playing at. And that a lot of that falls on D'Angelo Russell and Anthony Edwards. Okay, there's several more numbers I want to get to that just don't jive with what the Wolves were able to do last season. So we're going to get to that here in just a minute. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is presented by our friends at LinkedIn. As a small business owner or hiring manager, you know that success in 2023 all depends on the team members you surround yourself with. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. With LinkedIn Jobs, you can hire qualified candidates more efficiently by matching open roles with people who have the skills, values, and experiences to help you achieve your goals. LinkedIn Jobs helps you quickly attract qualified candidates to your open jobs with targeting tools. They go beyond resume data by using insights from your job post company and their 875 million member profiles to put your post in front of the most qualified candidates. Identify the most qualified candidates on LinkedIn Jobs and connect with them fast and for free. LinkedIn Jobs makes it easy to screen and rate applicants based on your job qualifications, all on one platform. We're a couple weeks into 2023 now. It's time to achieve your goals, and hiring the right team member just might help you do that. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs number one in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. All right, additional thoughts on things the Wolves have not been as good at this season as they were last year. We talked pace, we talked three-point rate, we talked three-point percentage. All of those things are related to one another. The free throw rate actually isn't down all that far. I was expecting it to be worse. They were 10th last year in free throw rate. They got to the line 10th most frequently in terms of when you consider possessions that actually shot attempts. This year, they're 12th. However, they are shooting the ball much worse from the line. They're 19th in free throw percentage this season league-wide. And last year they were 14th. So let's see. So percentage wise, they're 77.5% from three so far this season, 77.5%, which ranks 19th. Last season, the Timberwolves were roughly the same, actually, 77.8%, but it was 14th in the league. So the actual percentage is slightly worse. But the ranking is 5 spots worse. So free throws, I was a little bit surprised that it wasn't worse because I just, with no Karl-Anthony Towns and also intermittently injured, banged up Anthony Edwards, I was expecting the free throw rate to be a bit lower, but it's actually a little bit, not much worse. Now, the three-point rate, though, and the pace adds up to give the Wolves the 19th offensive rating in the league. Last year, they were 8th in offensive rating. So they're 19th in offensive rating right now, 8th last year at this overall at the end of the season. Another thing that plays into that, the last offensive statistic that I want to talk about, turnover rate. It's one of the 3 or 4 issues that consistently comes up on the live postcast with Marnie after every game. I'll talk about it on the postgame pod. What are the biggest issues? Transition, offense, and defense. That's one issue. Transition in general. Defensive rebounding, giving up second chance points to the opposition, taking care of the ball on offense, turnovers. Those are the 3 things we talk the most about. Turnover rate, last season, they were sloppy with the ball. They were 14th in offensive turnover rate, middle of the pack. This year, 27th in offensive turnover rate. Last year, they gave up, or they turned the ball over on 12.4% of possessions, which is a little higher than you want it to be. This year, 14.2%. Might not seem like a lot. That's a lot over the course of a game. When you're playing slower and you're turning it over at a higher rate, it's a recipe for disaster. And the turnover rate for the Wolves has been utterly careless this season. And the Pistons, look no further than that Pistons game early on. The Wolves just did not value the basketball. And the Houston game Sunday, I think, was almost worse from a turnover perspective, if I remember correctly, early in the game especially. They just don't value possessions. And also, and let me add this. This is like I'll get on a little bit of a soapbox here. I wasn't going to talk about this, but it just popped into my head. This isn't a turnover, but like I've mentioned it kind of like, it's frustrating. And Jim Peterson's mentioned it on Bally Sports North on the broadcast, the Wolves' fantastic color commentator. But the amount of times that like Naz Reid falls down and Towns when he was healthy was falling down and just kind of staying down. That's gotten worse and worse and worse and worse. And Naz Reid does it. He gives away a possession a game. I kid you not. I swear it is a possession a game. In the Detroit game, there was a possession where he did get elbowed in the face, but really wanted a call. Did the thing where he crouches down on the baseline and puts his head in his hand. And I'm not saying he wasn't in pain, but made no effort to get back. The Pistons got a 5-on-4. They scored, come back down on the floor. And yes, he's still in pain, but he plays the possession and goes on like nothing happened. And he's just ready to go. But there was no effort to get back. That happens more than one time a game. Usually it's just he falls down. And I'm singling out Naz Reid. He's not the only one, but he's the most obvious one. That is the same as a turnover. If you just choose to not get back on defense, it's a turnover. Like it just is. Like you can't give an NBA team a 5-on-4 and expect them to not score 75% of the time. I'm completely making that number up, but they should score at least 75% of the time, right? And it was just so like, then to act like it's not a big deal and for that to continue to happen, that happens once a game and you lose some of these games by a possession. That's the ball game. It should just count as a turnover. If you allow the other team to play 5-on-4. I'm off the soapbox. We're done with that, but it's frustrating. Pay attention to it next game. It's not only Naz, but Naz and Towns are the two biggest culprits. And now with Towns out, the spotlight's on Naz. One possession a game, I promise you. Pay attention for it on Friday night. All right. Defensively. Last season, the Timberwolves were second in defensive turnover rate. This year, they're ninth in defensive turnover rate. I should point out, the Wolves are better defensively this year. They're 16th in defensive rating. They were 12th before the Pistons game Wednesday. Last season, they actually finished 13th. So let me rephrase that. Sitting here right now, the Wolves do have a worse defensive rating than they finished last season with. I do think the Wolves will finish with a better defensive rating this year than they did last year. I think ultimately the defense is a top 12 defense in the league. That's going to even out. I'm not super worried about it. But because of the way they went about their business last year, there was a little bit higher variance, and it helped them steal some games that maybe they otherwise wouldn't have won. And I'm not saying that over the long haul that's better, and it's probably not. What I mean by that is they were second in forcing turnovers on defense. They were third in steals per game. They were third in blocks per game. It added up to 13th in defensive rating. It allowed them to beat bad, sloppy teams, frankly, like how the Wolves have been for much of this year offensively, like themselves, like this year's version of the Wolves. They could beat basically everyone else that was bad because they could create turnovers. They could generate fast break opportunities. They scored in transition. They played fast. They blitzed you in the pick and roll with Vanderbilt and Beverly and McDaniels. And they were just kind of playing at this breakneck speed defensively that led into a breakneck offensive pace. This year, the Wolves are playing much more laid back. They're playing primarily drop coverage with Rudy Gobert. They're not blitzing pick and rolls very often at all. And that means they're forcing less turnovers. They're getting less steals. They're weirdly enough blocking less shots, and they're not getting out in transition as much because they're just as bad defensive rebounding wise as they were last season. So all those turnovers you were generating last year kind of made up for the lack of defensive rebounding. We talked about this last season, right? The Wolves fouled too much and they didn't defensive rebound, but they generated steals. They turned teams over. And so then because of that and playing in transition, they were able to kind of make up for that. That doesn't balance out this year because you're not turning teams over at the same rate. They are ninth in defensive turnover rate. So they are a little bit, right? They're not a bad defense this season. But sitting here right now, they're sixth in steals per game. They finished last year third. They're seventh in blocks per game. They finished last year third in the league. It is a worse defense sitting here today. I think by the end of the season, they figured out Rudy into a little bit more into form. He's been generally better lately, although the Pistons game was worrisome. And I think it'll still be a good defense. But that's the primary difference between last year's defense when it was all said and done and this year's defense right now, is that that variance isn't there, right? You're not going to get that spike of like a crazy V8 Jared Vanderbilt game, or, Pat Bev being Pat Bev and frustrating the other team into a couple technicals and grabbing a steal. And like you're not getting that this year. You're not getting the do stuff things from guys like Vando and Bev. You're not. You're getting the opposite, like what I just ranted about with Naz Reid. You're getting the opposite with bad Jalen Noel possessions, right? On both ends of the floor. The defense has just not been consistent. And they were consistently inconsistent last year, but the highs were high. And this year it's just kind of like pretty good, pretty good, pretty good, pretty good, terrible game, pretty good, pretty good, pretty good, terrible game. It's like the baseline is maybe a little higher, but the lows are really low still, and there are no highs. Last year, there were some games that the Wolves won by wreaking havoc and by scrambling defensively themselves, forcing other teams to scramble offensively. We're not getting that this year. We're not getting that this year at all. All right. That's pretty much it on that. But weirdly, still going back to my first point in the show, the same record as the Wolves had at this time last year, and Karl-Anthony Towns is going to come back. Anthony Edwards hopefully gets healthy. There's a lot in front of the Wolves. I predicted on the midseason show right before this terrible loss to the Pistons on Wednesday. I said I thought the Wolves would end up winning, 43 games. I'm a little nervous about that. But at this point last year, forward, they ended up winning 46. So who knows? I mean, anything could happen. All right, let's preview Wolves-Suns. We'll do that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. Get the latest odds and trends for every pro and amateur league out there, from pro football to pro basketball. Of course, college basketball. We're in the meat of the conference schedule now in college basketball. NHL, any other sport that's ongoing here, we're going to get into. They're going to have, I'm sure, pro football draft stuff here in the next couple months as we get closer to the draft. Futures for all those leagues, for NFL, futures for MLB. I mean, MLB, the Twins signing Carlos Correa. I don't know what their projected win total's up to now, but pretty interesting stuff in MLB with the hot stove and the kind of the latter part of the offseason too. If you love sports podcasts, you can even find those at BetOnline too. They're the fastest and easiest way to get your bet and info. You can head to their website today or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, let's close today's show with a little bit of a Wolves-Suns preview. Now, the Timberwolves lost to the Suns twice in the first couple weeks of the season. Way back when, the first time they played each other, the Wolves were 4-3 coming into the game at Phoenix. I think that was a national TV game. Phoenix was 5-1 coming into the game. Phoenix ended up winning by 9. It was a game that they were up 7 at halftime and just kind of held the Wolves at arm's length for much of the game. The Minnesota made a bit of a push in the fourth quarter. Just a couple nights later, the Wolves took on Phoenix in Minnesota. They were 5-6 coming in. Phoenix was 7-3. And the Suns pretty much blew the Wolves out. They were up 18 at halftime. They were up 22 going to the fourth quarter. The Wolves made a bit of a push in the fourth, but it didn't really matter. Like, this thing was gone. And the Suns were pretty healthy, although Ayton missed the blowout. The other way around. Ayton didn't play in the first game. He played in the blowout. In the closer of the two games, DeAndre Ayton did not play. Bismack Biyombo started, but Rudy Gobert was very quiet. 7-9 against Bismack Biyombo in that first game with no DeAndre Ayton. D'Angelo Russell had only 5 points on 8 shots, played only 23 minutes. Anthony Edwards took 21 shots to get 24 points, and the Wolves were still in that game. It was because they turned it over 16 times. That was the biggest issue in that game. They also allowed Phoenix to make 17 threes on 40% shooting from deep. The second game, Ayton played and only had 9 and 6 in 33 minutes. But Gobert had 25 and 11. And, Karl-Anthony Towns had a quieter game that time around, I guess. But Jaden McDaniels had 24 and 8 in that game. But again, sloppy. 19 turnovers. Going back to what we talked about last segment, 19 turnovers in that loss to Phoenix. That was that blowout loss. and they shot just 33% from three. The Wolves did, and allowed Phoenix to shoot 46% from three. They made 16 threes, the Suns did, in that game. However, guys that played in those games that are not playing against the Wolves this time around. Chris Paul played in one of the two games. He played in the closer of the two, did not play in the other. He is unlikely to play. I think he's technically questionable as of this recording Thursday night, but he hasn't played in almost a week. He's missed 2.5 games or so. Devin Booker, we know, will not play due to injury. Cam Payne is unlikely to play. Let's see who else. Landry Shamet missed the game the other day. Oh, and I said Cam Payne. Cameron Johnson also. So Booker, Cameron Johnson, Chris Paul, Cam Payne, Landry Shamet. It's unlikely those guys play. None of them played Wednesday for Phoenix. They've now lost 4 out of 5. And if you look at their schedule, it goes back way further than that. Their recent troubles. They were like, I don't know. I had their schedule open. I lost it. They had a really, really good start to the year. They were like, I don't know, 8-2. And then they were like 12-5 or something. And then they've just gone on this crazy run of losing. They're only 21-22 now. So they're half game ahead of the Wolves in the Western Conference standings. The Wolves, of course, have to win both of their remaining games against Phoenix to not lose a potential tiebreaker, which is on the table at this point. I mean, Phoenix is like Josh Okogie has played heavy rotation minutes the last couple times out for them. And good for Josh. I love Josh Okogie, but it's generally not a good sign. I will say, though, in their loss to Denver, they scored just 97 points on Wednesday in a 29-point loss. But Okogie had 14, 9, and 5 in that game. Played 34 minutes off the bench for them. So expect him to get significant run at Target Center here for Phoenix on Friday, especially if, I guess really only if some of those guys don't play. Other former Timberwolves vibes, Dario Saric is starting for them, playing heavier minutes. He played against the Wolves in one of those games earlier this year. So we'll see some Saric. We'll see some Josh Okogie more likely than not. In terms of the actual matchup, I mean, this is still a really bad matchup for Minnesota, even though the Suns haven't been playing well. Minnesota should win. If I should also mention the Wolves injury report. Kyle Anderson's officially questionable. He missed the game Wednesday due to an illness, apparently a non-COVID illness, so presumably could play. Anthony Edwards is officially listed as questionable with the hip that knocked him out of and then allowed him back into the game the other day. And then Taurean Prince is officially questionable. He tweaked the ankle, came back and played against the Pistons Wednesday. I guess I'd be surprised if all three of them played. But regardless, unless they all three miss the game, like the Wolves should have a real shot at winning this game if there's no Booker, Johnson, Paul, Payne, Shamet. Like the Wolves should have a shot at home. Lost the Pistons Wednesday. The Suns are reeling. Like the Wolves should win. Now, the reason why it's a bad matchup is that Phoenix is a really good offensive rebounding team. DeAndre Ayton, I mean, should play in this game, right? Like DeAndre Ayton could very well. Well, actually, no, I say that. DeAndre Ayton actually missed the last couple games for them too. I forgot that he also had something too. What's he got going on? He's got an ankle. He missed the last 2 games for Phoenix, so he may not play either. So especially if DeAndre Ayton doesn't play. But again, he played in one of the 2 games against the Wolves earlier this year. But as a team in general, Phoenix is a really good offensive rebounding team, which does not bode well for the Wolves, who, as we talked about, are a terrible defensive rebounding team. Phoenix is 6th in the league in offensive rebound rate. And, I mean, even without DeAndre Ayton, like Mikal Bridges is a good offensive rebounder. Torrey Craig, the former Nugget, a good offensive rebounder. They've got a handful of guys, Biyombo, Okogie, for what it's worth. Like, he's an active player. Okogie's going to play harder than, I feel comfortable saying he's going to be playing harder than anybody on the Wolves on Friday, right? Especially coming back to Target Center, playing a rotation role if the Suns still have guys out due to injury. So, I don't know. That's a little scary to me. The offensive rebounding chops of the Suns, and also the likelihood that they're going to play hard, that some of these guys are going to play hard against the Wolves. So that would be my primary concern. I guess also they're a really good 3-point shooting team, which even with injuries, like there's guys in that team that can shoot. Like Bridges is a 39% 3-point shooter. Torrey Craig's over 40% this year. Shamet, if he plays, is almost 39%. So yeah, they're missing a lot of guys that can shoot, but like all of the rotation guys, except for Okogie, and then guys that don't shoot very many, like Ayton and Jock Landale, everybody else on this team is basically league average or better at 3-point shooting. This is the number 3 team in terms of percentage. They're only 15th in 3-point rate, but they make threes when they shoot them. So a team that can make open threes, plays hard, and grabs offensive rebounds is kind of a nightmare matchup for Minnesota. So even if all those guys are out, I don't feel great about this game. I don't think this is a good matchup for Minnesota, and that would be a concern of mine going into Friday night's game. We'll be live on the postcast with Marty Gellner following, as we always are. That's live on the Locked On Sports Minnesota YouTube channel. So not on Locked On Wolves, but on the Locked On Sports Minnesota YouTube channel. We go live. Usually it's after the Bally Sports North post game. It will be still, but it'll actually be a little bit earlier on this Friday. It'll be about 30 minutes after the final horn. We'll be live with Marnie on the YouTube channel at Locked On Sports Minnesota. We do post that audio on the Locked On Wolves audio feed. So if you're listening to this on Apple, Google, Spotify, Odyssey, wherever, you can find all those postcast episodes with myself and Marnie that we record live after the game. So we'll do that on Friday. We'll do that on Saturday also. We didn't spend any time previewing Saturday's game, but the Timberwolves have a challenging weekend ahead for the Wolves. They have the Cleveland Cavaliers on Saturday. Ricky Rubio, by the way, playing on Thursday night for the first time since right after Christmas over a year ago. So I don't know if he'll play again in 2 days on Saturday, but perhaps we get to see Ricky Rubio on Saturday. The Cleveland game will be a challenge. The Wolves beat them earlier this year with no Donovan Mitchell and among others, and then Utah Monday. So we'll do the live postcast on Friday. We'll do one on Saturday, and then we'll have a show Monday morning on Martin Luther King Jr. Day. The Timberwolves play a matinee on Monday afternoon. So we'll have a show early Monday. So listen to that to get you ready for the show. We'll talk about the Cleveland game Saturday, the weekend as a whole, and preview Wolves Jazz. It's been a minute since we've seen them before Wolves Jazz on Monday afternoon. And then following that game, so around 6:30, 6:45 or something like that, Marnie and I will go live to talk Wolves Jazz as well. So a really busy next few days in Wolves land. And here's hoping things turn around by the time we get to Monday. All right, that's all we have for you today here on the show. A big thank you for those of you that do make Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. The Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Now make your second listen the Game to Game NBA podcast for every moment, every top performance, and every result. Locked On Game to Game covers every game from across the NBA with local analysis that only Locked On can deliver. Follow Game to Game on Locked On NBA, available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcast. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.